5 words. That is the entire response I want to walk you through today. Not a press release stitched together by a communications team that spent all night deciding which adjectives were safe. Not a coordinated rollout across ministry accounts, timed to the minute, focus grouped down to the punctuation. 5 words, delivered in reply to a letter that landed on Mark Carney's desk carrying a threat with a deadline attached to it. And here is the part that most of the coverage skipped right over, the part I cannot stop thinking about. There was no outrage in those 5 words, no wounded pride, no long thread of counter-threats. Just 5 words, calm and flat and almost boring on the surface. And yet those 5 words told Washington something it did not want to hear and did not have a ready answer for. I am going to get to the words. I promise you that. But if I just hand them to you right now, cold, with no context, you are going to read them and shrug and click away, and you will have missed the entire point. Because the power of what Carney said is not in the words themselves. It is in everything standing behind them. It is in what Ottawa already knew when that letter arrived and what the White House assumed Ottawa did not know. So stay with me because the sequence is everything here. We are going to walk through exactly what landed on that desk, why it was designed the way it was, and why the response froze the momentum of an entire pressure campaign. And by the time we reach those 5 words, you are going to feel exactly why they mattered. Why? Let me set the scene properly, because the letter did not come out of nowhere. This has been building for months, and to understand the response, you have to understand the campaign it was responding to. Somewhere around the middle of July, President Trump sent Prime Minister Carney a letter. Not a phone call, not a quiet diplomatic cable passed between officials. A letter, the kind of thing designed to be public, to be quoted, to be waved around. And the contents were blunt. Effective the 1st of August, tariffs on Canadian goods would climb to 35%. 35. Not as a final measure after negotiations collapsed, but as a pressure tactic while negotiations were supposedly still alive. The justification stacked into that letter leaned on 2 pillars. One was a trade deficit figure, more than $46 billion, presented as evidence that Canada had somehow been taking advantage of its neighbor. The other was fentanyl, the flow of it across the border, folded into a trade dispute as moral cover for an economic weapon. Now, I want you to notice something about the structure of that threat, because the structure is the whole strategy. A letter with a number and a date is not really about the number or the date. It is about forcing the other side into a reaction. It is a clock placed on the table, ticking loud enough that everyone in the room feels it. The entire idea is that the smaller party looks at the calendar, looks at the number, does the frantic arithmetic of how much pain 35% would inflict, and rushes to the table ready to give something up just to make the ticking stop. That is the play. It has been the play the whole time. Set a deadline, attach a scary figure, and let anxiety do the negotiating for you. And to understand why that play was aimed at Canada specifically, you have to go back a little further, because this letter was not the first move. It was the latest move in a sequence stretching back to the start of the year. There were the earlier tariffs. There was the language, and I mean the language that genuinely had not been used toward Canada in the modern era. The offhand musings about whether Canada really needed to be its own country at all, the casual talk about lines on a map as though 70 years of the closest alliance on Earth were just a suggestion someone could revise on a whim. None of that was accidental. None of it was a slip of the tongue from a man who talks too much. It was deliberate, and it was built to accomplish one specific psychological goal. It was designed to make Canada feel small. To plant the idea, before a single negotiation began, that the outcome was already decided, that Canada was the weaker party, the dependent party, the one who should be grateful the terms were not even harsher. Everything, and I mean everything, in that campaign rested on one assumption, a single load-bearing belief holding the whole strategy up. The belief was that Canada needed the United States far more than the United States needed Canada, that the relationship was lopsided, that if you applied enough pressure for long enough, the numbers would eventually force Canada to fold, because a smaller economy simply cannot survive a drawn-out fight with a larger one. Squeeze hard, squeeze long, and the smaller country runs the math and surrenders. That was the bet underneath the tariffs, underneath the insults, underneath that letter with its 35% and its August 1st deadline. Here is what makes this story so interesting to me, and why I think it matters far more than a single news cycle. That assumption was wrong. Not slightly wrong, not wrong at the margins, wrong at the foundation. And the man who received that letter happened to be exactly the wrong person to try this particular bluff on. Let me tell you who actually opened that envelope, because Carney's response only makes sense once you understand the person giving it. Mark Carney did not spend his life climbing the usual political ladder of rallies and slogans and learning how to dodge a reporter's question. He spent his career in the rooms where the numbers are real and the stakes are measured in the hundreds of billions. He ran Canada's central bank through the 2008 financial crisis, the kind of environment where a single poorly chosen sentence can erase fortunes before lunch. Then he did something almost nobody in history has done. He crossed the ocean and ran a second country's central bank entirely, the Bank of England, the first foreigner ever to hold that post. And he did it straight through Brexit, which was not a tidy policy debate, but a slow institutional earthquake that could have shattered a financial system if handled by someone who panicked. So when a threat lands on the desk of a man like that, a threat built entirely on the hope that he will feel fear and rush to react, you have to understand what a mismatch that is. This is a person whose entire professional life has been the discipline of staying perfectly still while everyone around him loses their composure. He knows something that the people who wrote that letter apparently did not. A deadline is only a weapon if you are afraid of it. A scary number is only leverage if you believe the other side holds more cards than you do. Take away the fear, and the whole apparatus of pressure just sits there, ticking, accomplishing nothing. And this is where I need to show you the part of the story that the letter absolutely did not want anyone examining, because the numbers do not say what the pressure campaign assumed they said. Let us actually look at the leverage, because leverage is the entire question here. The assumption was that Canada was the dependent one. But look at what the United States actually gets from its northern neighbor. A massive share of American crude oil imports come from Canada, feeding refineries that were literally built to process that specific grade of oil and cannot simply switch to another source overnight. The automotive supply chain does not stop at the border. It crosses it back and forth, a single part traveling over the line multiple times before it becomes a finished car, meaning tariffs do not just hit Canada. They hit the factories and the workers on the American side, too. Critical minerals, the ones the United States needs to compete with China on everything from defense to batteries. A significant portion runs through Canadian supply. This is not the profile of a country that has no choice but to fold. This is the profile of a country that is woven so deeply into the American economy that hurting it means hurting yourself in the same motion. And Ottawa knew this. That is the thing I need you to hold on to. When that letter arrived with its 35%, Carney was not looking at it the way the sender hoped he would. He was not seeing an unstoppable threat from a stronger power. He was seeing a bluff from a partner who needed the relationship at least as badly, dressed up as an ultimatum. The clock on the table was ticking for both sides, and a threat only works when one side has forgotten that. Now here is a detail that tells you Ottawa understood the game better than it was given credit for. Just before all of this escalated, Canada made a move that got read in a lot of places as a simple retreat. It dropped the digital services tax, the levy that had been aimed at large technology companies, dropping it right as the pressure over the trade relationship intensified. And the quick take, the lazy take, was that Canada blinked, that it caved to get talks restarted. But look at it again with the full picture in mind. That was not a country panicking. That was a country clearing away a small symbolic irritant so that it could not be used as a distraction, so that the real conversation, the one about tariffs and the trade architecture of an entire continent, could not be muddied by a side argument. You give up the thing that costs you little to keep the thing that matters. That is not weakness. That is a negotiator deciding which fights are worth having. And it set the stage for exactly the kind of calm, unbothered posture that would define the response to the letter. So let us walk right up to the moment. The letter is public. The number is out there, 35%, and the date, August 1st, and the whole world of business and politics on both sides of the border is waiting to see how Ottawa reacts. Does Carney fire back with his own threats? Does he hold an emotional press conference denouncing the insult? Does he rush a delegation to Washington waving concessions? Every one of those reactions would have handed the sender exactly what the letter was designed to extract, which is the visible proof that the pressure was working, that Canada felt the fear. He did none of it. And the essence of the Canadian response, distilled down, the thing that captured the entire posture in a handful of plain words, was this: we will not negotiate under threat. 5 words carrying the whole thing. We will not negotiate under threat. Now, I know how that sounds on first hearing. It sounds simple. It sounds like something anyone could say. But hold on, because the power is not in the vocabulary. It is in what those 5 words actually do to the situation. Think about what a threat needs in order to function. It needs the other side to engage with it on its own terms. It needs the target to accept the frame, to accept that yes, there is a clock, yes, there is pressure, and now we must respond to that pressure. The moment Canada said it would not negotiate under threat, it did something quietly devastating. It refused to accept the frame at all. It took the clock off the table. It said, in effect, we are happy to talk about trade. We are ready to talk about trade, but we will not do it while a gun is pointed at the conversation, because a deal made under duress is not a deal. It is a surrender, and surrenders do not hold. And that put the sender of the letter in an impossible spot, because now the pressure had nowhere to go. You cannot escalate a threat against someone who has calmly announced they will not respond to threats without looking like the aggressor in a fight with an ally. You cannot claim the deadline is forcing negotiations when the other side has said the deadline is precisely why they will not rush. The entire mechanism of the letter, the ticking clock, the scary number, all of it depended on Canada being afraid. Take away the fear, and the letter is just paper. This is the part I really want you to sit with, because it is the deeper lesson underneath the whole episode. There is a kind of strength that looks like strength. Raised voices, pointed fingers, dramatic walkouts, the theater we have all been trained to recognize as power. And then there is a different kind of strength that does not look like strength at all until you understand what it is doing. The refusal to be rattled. The willingness to let a deadline pass rather than sign a bad deal to beat it. The composure to say 5 flat words and then simply stop talking, letting the silence do the rest. That second kind is much harder to fight because there is nothing to push against. You throw your weight forward expecting resistance, and there is just calm, and you stumble. Let me put this in the context of what was happening around the same time, because Canada was not operating in a vacuum. The USMCA, the trade agreement that governs nearly $2 trillion of commerce across the continent, had just passed its critical review point, and the United States had declined to lock in a long extension, choosing instead to push everything into a cycle of rolling annual reviews. No clean renewal, no replacement. Just an open-ended stretch of uncertainty deliberately created. And in that same period, Mexico had moved fast to build its own bilateral track with Washington, securing formal negotiating rounds, positioning itself as the cooperative partner. The narrative being built was that Canada was being left behind, isolated, the odd one out, the one who had not even started formal talks while Mexico raced ahead. And that narrative fed directly into the pressure. The letter with its 35% was meant to land on a Canada that felt isolated and behind and anxious about being frozen out. That is what makes the calm so significant. Carney was being told, in effect, everyone else is playing ball, you are alone, the clock is running, sign or suffer. And the response was not panic about being left out. It was that same steady refusal. We will not negotiate under threat. It reframed the isolation as a choice rather than an abandonment. It said we are not behind, we are simply not willing to be stampeded. Now, I want to be fair and honest with you, because I am not here to pretend that calm words make tariffs disappear or that Canada has no vulnerabilities. It has real ones. The Bank of Canada reported that the economy contracted in the second quarter, gross domestic product falling as the tariff pressure worked its way through exports and into the labor market. That is real pain. That is real cost. Factory orders, jobs, investment decisions, all sitting frozen because businesses cannot plan around rules that might change every year. I am not going to insult you by pretending the pressure had no bite. It did. It does. But here's the thing about that pain, and this is the point the pressure campaign kept getting wrong. Pain flows both directions in a relationship this integrated. The tariffs that hurt a Canadian exporter also raise the cost of the parts an American manufacturer needs. The uncertainty that freezes investment in Ontario also freezes it in the supply chains that feed Michigan and Ohio. When your economies are stitched together this tightly, you cannot squeeze one side without the pain traveling straight back up your own arm. So the question was never simply whether Canada could withstand the pressure. It was whether the side applying the pressure could withstand the blowback long enough to make Canada fold first. And Ottawa's bet, the bet underneath those 5 words, was that it could not. That the pain would become politically intolerable on the other side, that the industries and the consumers absorbing higher costs would eventually ask why, and that patience was the stronger position precisely because the pressure was expensive for the one applying it. That is what makes refusing to negotiate under threat such a shrewd move rather than just a proud one. It is not stubbornness for its own sake. It is a calculated read of who can outlast whom. If you genuinely believe the other side needs you as much as you need them, then the worst thing you can do is rush. Rushing signals fear, and fear invites more pressure. Patience signals confidence, and confidence makes the threat look hollow. Every day that passes without Canada panicking is a day the letter looks a little more like a bluff and a little less like an ultimatum. And think about the position that leaves the sender in. You have publicly attached your credibility to a number and a date. You have told the world 35% August 1st. Now the date approaches, and the other side has simply refused to be moved by it. You have 2 options, and both are bad. You can follow through and impose the tariffs, inflicting real damage on your own industries and consumers, while looking like the party that broke an alliance over a trade dispute, which is not a good look for anyone claiming to want a deal. Or you can let the deadline slide quietly, hoping nobody notices that the ultimatum came and went without consequence, which drains every future threat of its power. Once a deadline passes without teeth, the next deadline is just a suggestion. That is the trap that calm refusal builds. It forces the aggressor to choose between self-harm and self-exposure. This is why I keep coming back to those 5 words. We will not negotiate under threat. On the surface, plain. Underneath, it rearranged the entire board. It took a situation engineered to make Canada the anxious party rushing to the table and turned it into a situation where the pressure itself became the obstacle to a deal, which meant the burden of fixing that shifted back across the border. If you want to talk, put down the threat. Now the next move belongs to the other side, and every option they have costs them something. I want to step back now and talk about why this pattern matters beyond this single letter, beyond this single week of headlines, because I think we are watching something get relearned in real time. There has been an assumption baked into a lot of international pressure lately, the assumption that size wins, that the bigger economy simply dictates terms to the smaller one, that leverage is just a function of raw scale. And what this episode illustrates is how incomplete that thinking is. Leverage is not only about how big you are, it is about how much the other side needs what you have, how integrated you are into their success, and crucially, how willing you are to absorb short-term pain rather than accept a bad long-term structure. A smaller party that understands its own indispensability and has the nerve to wait is not actually the weaker party. It just looks that way to anyone counting only the size of the economies. And Carney, of all the people to try this on, understood that instinctively because his entire career trained him to see through panic to the underlying position. A run on a currency, a crisis in a banking system, a market in free fall. These are all situations where the pressure is designed to make you act rashly and where the people who survive are the ones who can hold still and read the real fundamentals underneath the noise. A tariff letter with a scary number and a looming date is, in its own way, the same kind of test. It is engineered panic. And the response to engineered panic, if you know what you are doing, is not to match the energy. It is to lower it, to go quiet, to say 5 words and let the other side sit with the silence. So where does this leave things, honestly? Not resolved. I want to be clear about that because I am not going to sell you a fairy tale ending. The tariffs are a real threat. The economic pain is real. The uncertainty around the future of the entire North American trade structure is genuine. And it is not going away with one calm statement. This is not a story where 5 words end a trade war. But it is a story about who set the terms of the fight, and that matters enormously, because whoever controls the frame of a negotiation controls a great deal of its outcome. And in this exchange, the side that was supposed to be cornered, the side that was supposed to feel small and rush to the table, instead calmly redrew the frame and handed the hard choices back across the border. That is the moment most of the coverage rushed past, chasing the drama of the number and the deadline. The real story was not 35%. It was the refusal to treat 35% as a gun to the head. The real story was a country that had been told for months that it was dependent and fragile and out of options, looking at a threatening letter and responding not with fear, but with the quiet confidence of someone who has actually read the numbers and knows what the other side stands to lose. 5 words. Ottawa never blinked. And the reason it never blinked is that it understood something the letter's author seemed to have forgotten, which is that you cannot corner someone who knows they are not actually cornered. If this is the kind of breakdown you want, the story underneath the headline instead of just the headline, then this is exactly what we do here. I dig into these moments, the diplomatic ones, the trade ones, the ones where the real meaning is hiding just underneath the surface coverage. And I try to give you the context that makes them make sense. If that is what you are here for, subscribe to Laura Hayes Talks and stay with me because this trade fight is nowhere near finished. And the next moves are going to tell us a great deal about who actually holds the leverage on this continent. I read every comment, so tell me where you land on this. Was refusing to negotiate under threat the right call, or does Canada need to get to the table faster before the economic pain deepens? I genuinely want to know how you see it. I am Laura Hayes. This is Laura Hayes Talks, and I will see you in the next one.